Okay, here you go, folks. You're going to get me again for this one. Motivational mechanisms. Now, I've already talked a little bit about some of the other motivational stuff in terms of what we can do with regard to applying this. So this lecture is going to go through I don't know what you call it, kind of the theories. So let me shut my door quick. I forgot to do that, and then I will start jumping into this. All right, here we go. So the question for this chapter is essentially, what are the theories behind how is motivation or how is behavior motivated? Now, theories are like armpits. Everybody's got two and they both stink. In other words, I'm not a big theory guy, okay? I really focus, as you guys remember from the introductory video, I really focus heavily on what works in terms of how can we get behavior to change and how does that happen. And this chapter is a little bit different because it is focused primarily on the different theories about how behavior may change and why we would motivate. And I do have some issues with the fact that it's theory, but it's worth looking at to get some of these different ideas about what's going on. When we get into the next page, I'll tell you, I'm hemming and hawing here because there's some caveats that I'm going to add. Right? So we've got two different main theories, and they fall in the line along these lines of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. They also tend to follow along the lines of cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology. So what we're really getting at here is kind of the really big differences between how does behavior work and how do people change and how do we actually motivate and modify ourselves and how is our behavior modified in general. And there's two really big schools of thought. One of those is a more cognitive school, which tends to be closely associated with these associative processes, and the other one is a behavioral one, which is less cognitive. It's more of a mechanistic type of view. So let's go ahead and look at those. The associative processes, Thorndike and Pavlov, right? So we're thinking about associating things. Now, you don't always think about Thorndike as being associative, but in reality, his theories were. He talked about the law of effect and how you associate a good event with a particular behavior, and you associate a bad event with a particular behavior, and that event increases or decreases in the behavior, right? These things are very molecular, and when I say molecular, I mean it really looks at the individual level response. It looks at that each and every component, right? So there's a stimulus, there's a response, and there's another stimulus, and it looks at each little piece, and it looks at how you develop associations within there. Okay, this is opposed to the behavioral regulation stuff, which again we're looking at here with Skinner. This tends to fit more with Skinner's models, looking at punishment, reinforcement, extinction, and things like that. It's a little bit of it's very clean, it's very parsimonious, right? And it's also very molar. The behavioral regulation stuff is looking in general, how would we behave and what motivates behavior, rather than each individual very little response. So when we talk about molar, we're talking about just kind of a bigger picture of behavior. Molecular is those individual tiny little things about moving your hand one way or making one particular decision in one particular context. Right? Again, behavioral regulation stuff is also going to focus on function. So what does the behavior get you? Okay, in terms of, does it work in your environment? Think of, there's a million different ways to turn on a light switch, right? You can turn it on with your arm, you can turn it on with your hand, you can turn it on with your head, you can turn it on with your foot, you can turn it on with your butt if you were skilled enough. But the point is that all those things serve the same function. They flip the light switch, right? So the lights will come on no matter how you approach it. So that's going to be more of a behavioral regulation approach. Whereas the associative process from a molecular thing would talk about, here's why you would use your left hand to turn on the light, blah, 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 that type of thing. All right, so let's move on to a note about notation. Ha, 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 great joke, great. So now, your author's notation. There's a stimulus, there's a response, and there's an outcome. All right, SRO. It drives me nuts. I don't like O's. For some reason, when I learned this stuff, there was no O's involved. I understand why your author does it, and I'll actually test on you the way your author talks about it. And the reason I do that is because I want it to be clean for you as you're going through the book and you learn the material, and it's a little easier if I follow that. But when I talk and when I give these lectures, I'm going to be presenting it to you as this. Okay? A stimulus, a response, and another stimulus. Now, what you'll notice is that I have an SD up front. That's a discriminative stimulus, which you'll remember from the other chapters, and then a response, or behavior, and then you have a stimulus, again, but this is a stimulus that reinforces, so an SR, or an SP, a stimulus that punishes, and then you have the plus minus. A stimulus that reinforces plus would be positive reinforcement, right? And a stimulus that punishes plus would be positive reinforcement or positive punishment. So you get, it's just quicker notation. It's like stimulus, a reinforcing stimulus, a positively reinforcing stimulus, negatively reinforcing stimulus, positive punishing stimulus, or a negative punishing stimulus. So that's the approach that I prefer. Again, for me, the O gets confusing, but I can understand why your author does it, because it gets really confusing talking about SS's and S's and S's and S's that are pairing with each other and associating, and you have multiple S's, and which one are you talking about? So your author talks about the outcome, the consequence, right? But no matter which way you slice it, it's all the same thing. The SDs come up front, the response is in the middle, and then the consequence happens at the end. That consequence is just an outcome of the behavior. So it makes sense either way, all right? But again, I'm going to be talking about this as an SRS. So keep that in mind. It's when you're working through the chapter that my lecture here sounds a little different. Okay, so let's look at the associative perspectives first. Right? It does use an SRS system. It is a three-term contingency. This is the stuff that's consistent with Thorndike and Pavlov, but it does focus on individual responses. Right? So we're focusing on each and every response you may make rather than a large category of responses that all serve the same function. Right? And it focuses on association. So let's see how this association develops. Here's the association that's made. It's the SR association. The stimulus leads to a particular response. It equals a response. You learn what that response is. Now, this association, the red part, is influenced, okay, by the consequence. So your book is going to call that the outcome, right? So the last stimulus here, the last component in the three-term contingency, is what strengthens or weakens the association. So reinforcers are going to strengthen that association between the stimulus and the response. So it becomes this automated sort of thing, right? Stimulus, response, and it's almost what do you call it? It's almost classical in the sense they're classically conditioned, and that's why I'd say it's related to Pavlov stuff, because when people are taking an associative structure view of motivation, they're really saying that this is an automatic sort of reflex in that context. So that stimulus leads to that response period, then the consequence is going to strengthen or weaken that association, right? So punishers, again, are things that reduce behavior, so that's going to then reduce that association between the stimulus and the response. Why does this fit Thorndike? Well, because Thorndike was talking about effects that are stamped in and stamped out. So the behavior is stamped in a particular context, that's reinforcement. Behavior is stamped out in another context, that's punishment, right? So those consequences are then affecting that association. What will the organism likely do? Right? So that's that first part of the associative structure. Okay? And let's look at it a little further in the actual association itself. So here is what is connected. The stimulus, so the environment is connected to that consequence. Right? So because of that, right, so you experience this one thing, and like we talked about on the previous slide, and then now what we're really connecting is the stimulus to the stimulus. The book is going to call this the SO association, right? So the stimulus, whatever that is, the red light, is connected with a particular consequence, right, which will then influence you to decide what behavior to do, because you're going to get that consequence. So that stimulus, the first one, is going to lead to some consequence, lead to some outcome, right? But you then have to decide what that response is going to be. So it connects the environment or the context to a particular context. So what you're learning in this type of associative structure is that you have an environmental situation, an environmental clue, or a discriminative stimulus, whatever you want to call it, is connected with a reinforcer, a punisher, or it's connected with an outcome, a consequence. Those are all synonyms for the same thing. Then because of that connection, that then tells you, oh, because I will get this in this environment, I should do this, right? So this connection between the S and the S, or the S and the O, whichever way you're looking at it, will then inform you about what decision you need to make in the environment, right? Or about what decision you need to make for your behavior. In other words, it's motivating your behavior. It's the expectation of the outcome that motivates. So you expect this reinforcer, you expect a punisher, and that's what actually motivates you, is that expectancy. Okay? I'm not a big fan of this. From a behavioral perspective, from a personal perspective, I don't like this because it doesn't seem clean. It adds this expectation. You'll notice I put a couple of things in red. And that expectation is something we can't observe, right? So we couldn't observe the theory is something I didn't like, so I put it in red. Expectation, again, something else I don't really like, so I put it in red. So again, we can explain this in a different way, and we're going to come back to that different way here in a minute when we talk about the behavioral regulation stuff. But really, this is just kind of, for me, it's just tough. It's like, why are we adding that expectation when we can explain it in a different way? But that expectation is what supposedly does the motivation. You don't see the expectation in the diagram here. You just see that connection between the S and the S. In reality, the S and the S, according to these theorists, will then produce an expectation about what will happen if I behave in a particular way. All right. A reaction to this stuff was to present, the Rescorla and Solomon presented something a little different, and they said that this is really about how two processes interact. This is really about classical conditioning and operant conditioning combining and producing something else, right, and producing that particular response. So let's look at how they do that. So the classical conditioning or responding conditioning and instrumental combine to produce the motivators for behavior. So let's look at how they do this. And again, there's an extra term added in here, but we'll get through it. Same type of thing, right? Stimulus and stimulus. So we learn about a particular environment, and we learn that a particular consequence is going to happen in that environment. Okay, so that's the same as what we had before. But here's what they say. They say that this leads to an emotional state, right? So a punisher will lead to a particular emotional state. A reinforcer is going to lead to a particular emotional state. And that will in turn, modify the behavior. Okay? That emotional state is determined by the type of consequence. Now, what I have up here is a change in emotional state, right? So that's the delta. Okay? So the change in emotional state leads to a particular response. So in the context, so we'll build the whole, let's work through the whole thing. In a particular context, it is likely to be connected with a reinforcer or a punisher. If that context is connected with a reinforcer, that's going to make you happier or something like that, which will lead to you doing that response, be more likely to do that. Okay? If that particular consequence or context is tied in with a consequence of punishment, which usually produces frustration, anger, sadness, those types of things, then it will lead you to not make that response. It's the opposite sort of thing there. Okay? So that is that the two-process model broken down. It's always about this change in emotional states. And there's some great examples in your book, so flip through those particular examples. But keep in mind that it's the emotional state that's really driving the organism there, instead of the expectancy of something. So in the previous model, it was the expectancy that drove the behavior, that's what motivated it. Here, it's the emotional state that actually motivates your particular behavior. Right? That particular state is determined by the type of stimulus, right? In terms of the consequence stimulus, or as your book will say, the outcome. One outcome will lead to one emotional state. But again, it's about that initial connection that's built, which then says, oh, I will likely be happy if I do this, right? And then you choose to do it. Or I will likely be sad if I do this, and then you choose to avoid that, or go ahead and do it anyway. But that's the idea. So that's the dual process stuff. The two processes are working together, the reinforcers and the punishers and those types of things. All right, let's look at it from the other perspective, behavioral regulation. Okay, so this is what's going to tie closely with Skinner. Right? Uses an SRS system again, right? But we focus on the third term. Okay? That third term, that third constant, the third stimulus there. So there, the third term is the second stimulus. So the consequence is what's most important. All right? This is not about forming associations. Basically, what this is talking about is that the organism learns a limit of their behavior. We're not talking about building an extra thing and then using that to decide and then changing your emotional states and blah, blah, blah. We're not talking about all that stuff here. This is a bit more simple. Is it more right? I don't know. None of us know. These are both theories, right? But this is the one that I tend to gravitate more towards. Right? So you might hear me talking about it a little more positively. But let's look at some of the implications here. So with behavioral regulation, what it's saying is that you learn to do your behavior according to what gets a reinforcer, right? So this fits perfectly with the matching law from the previous chapter, which is interesting because Rescorla, who was part of the dual process stuff in this lecture, was really about, was also the matching law guy. So it's interesting that he kind of made a different connection there. So Who knows? Just one of those little side note trivia sort of things. Anyway, so you're going to redistribute your activity accordingly to the outcome or the consequence. So if you're going to get reinforced for something, you're more likely to do that. If you're going to get punished for something, you're less likely to do that. And if you've got two events that you're doing, the one that produces the most reinforcement is the one that you're going to be doing more of. Right? Pretty straightforward. The other thing that's part of behavioral regulation, and this is the one that really changed the field, and we got a whole other slide on this, right? Is that reinforcers aren't stimuli. They're actually behaviors, right? So reinforcers are actually preferred behavior. No matter what you do, when you're thinking about a reinforcer, it's always you're doing something. You're playing with a reinforcer. You're eating a reinforcer, a consumatory one. You're drinking a reinforcer. There's all these things, and they all lead back to some type of activity that you are doing. They may be a stimulus, but you're still doing something with that. Money that's a reinforcer, well, it's not receiving the money that's actually the reinforcer. It's the ability to spend it. It's going out and spending it. And at least that's what these theories would say. So Premack was the guy that really turned everything on its ear here, because he originally thought, we originally thought that reinforcers were just stimuli. It was just the food added, and it wasn't the actual behavior. But when Premack says, no, I think it's the behavior, then that opened a whole new can of worms, and this is the can of worms. What he found out through a simple study, and we'll look at that study here in a minute, is that high probability behavior will reinforce low probability behavior. In other words, what if there's something out there that you like to do? In other words, that's something that's high probability. If given an opportunity, you would engage in it, right? That will reinforce low probability behavior. Right? Working on, let's say, for example, for me, one of the things that I enjoy to do, woodwork, or working on cars, restoring old cars and things like that. Those are things that I prefer to do. I like those things. So it's high probability behavior. Those things will reinforce stuff like me mowing the lawn, which I really don't like to do, or picking weeds, which I just absolutely hate to do, right? So if I pick the weeds and then give myself access to, let's say, working on the truck or working in the wood shop for a little while, that might actually reinforce my weed picking behavior, okay, by getting access to working on the truck. But of course, you have to do the weed picking first, and you have to limit access to the truck or to the whatever you call it, the woodworking stuff, and that's that kind of ties in with what I was talking about in the previous lecture in this chapter, unit, whatever we call these things. Anyway, again, this indicates that reinforcement is access to a particular behavior, okay, and not that reinforcement is some particular stimulus, but it's actually doing something. It's playing with your friends. It's having these social interactions, right? So you've got this low probability behavior on the bottom here. The monkey just doing whatever, right? Or the monkey's not a monkey. The orangutan just doing whatever. And that may be reinforced by getting access to your sibling or to another social mate or something like that. So you could reinforce hanging from the rope by playing with your friends. This has been used all over the place. Premack is an awesome tool, and it's been used across the board. It's one of those go-to things that we have when we're doing behavior modification with people and with children or adults, for that matter. Right? This is kind of a weird one. I think it comes out of your book, but there was an experiment done where they used high probability behavior, which was sitting. Right? So for these people with schizophrenia, one of the things that they would always do would sit. So what they said was, you can only sit after you've stripped coils. Which sounds really weird. The idea is that they were given some sort of task, right? And that task served some sort of function. The idea was to unwind these coils of copper wire. And that served some purpose for whatever reason. I don't really know what the purpose is, but it was like a job, right? So think of it that way. So their job was to unwind these coil things. And you could reinforce that by letting them sit if they had stripped the coil. And it made the coil stripping more likely. It's been used with autism. Echolalia reinforces some type of training task. This actually worked better than food. In other words, allowing the kid the opportunity to engage in the echolalia, then reinforce them doing work on, say, some communication skill or something like that, some training task. And it actually worked better than just general food. So the behavior that they really wanted to do, the echolalia, was something that was a much stronger reinforcer than something like just access to an M&M or something like that. This is where the shockers were. And again, let's look at the original study, and it breaks it down a little closer. All right. So what you got is you got kids in this group, and we were looking, and what Premack was doing was he was looking to see what can reinforce these kids. So he gave the kids an opportunity to do to do a series of things. And those series of things included stuff like eating candy or playing pinball. So he broke these kids into two groups. The kids that would choose eating candy over playing pinball, or the kids that would choose playing pinball over eating candy. Right? So you have these two natural groups: high probability behavior, eating candy, or high probability behavior, playing pinball. So then what he did was he had the kids that preferred to eat candy. He made them play pinball, but then he positively reinforced them with eating candy. Right? And guess what? Their pinball playing increased. Or he had the kids eating candy. He then gave them access to playing pinball, and what do you know? The candy eating behavior increased. So what we found out here is that the kids that preferred to play a pinball were then put into a category where they had to eat candy first, and then given access to pinball, their candy eating behavior went up, and vice versa for the candy eating group and the pinball and so on and so forth. So this clearly demonstrated that access to a behavior will reinforce another behavior. Of course, in order for this to really work effectively, what we need to worry about is response deprivation. We've already talked about this a little bit. This is one of those motivating operations that go in front of the three-term contingency. So if we limit access to reinforcer, the preferred activity, that makes that reinforcer more valuable. And it even works with low probability behavior. So if you're engaging in some if there's some behavior that you might not get an opportunity to do very often, but it's low probability. If I limit your access to that particular thing, then now guess what? I can actually use that as a behavior or as a reinforcer because you haven't had a chance to do it for a while. Right? Again, the goal with response deprivation is hold a behavior at baseline, at or below baseline level, okay, and an access to it will now be a reinforcer for some other behavior. Right? Again, baseline level, whatever level you would normally engage in if given a free opportunity to do so. Okay. Well, people came along and said, why in the world does this work? And so they came up with this, behavioral bliss. Okay. Behavioral regulation theory predicts that a preferred level of responding is going to exist. That's going to be stable. It's going to be baseline. So think of me doing the woodwork. Okay, I prefer to do X amounts of woodwork a day. Okay, whatever that may be. So it's going to earn me some reinforcers. Okay, the example I have in here is engaging in TV watching, but I'll come back to the woodworking example in a second. So engaging in TV watching, that exists at some standard level. Okay? Wheel running also exists at some standard level. We could also think of wheel running as, say, treadmill or going for a jog. Okay? Eating is another behavior that exists at some standard level, as does doing homework. Right? So each one of these things has a preferred level of responding in you right now, right? So the idea is that all of this stuff is being maintained at a particular rate. Ultimately, they're all upon some particular stable level. And what we're trying to do as humans and other organisms as well is maximize our reinforcers. We're trying to get to that behavioral bliss point. What do I want to do the most of, right? Well, I've still got to do homework and I've still got to eat. So that reduces the amount of wheel running time or engaging in TV watching time that I have, right? So essentially what we're saying is that you don't always get the chance to do everything you want at all times. So you have to balance these activities. Right? So what we do is we redistribute, based on our condition and our context, we redistribute behaviors to maximize the amount of bliss that we're experiencing. Right? We're trying to maximize the reinforcers. Right? Pretty straightforward. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's too far of a stretch. I mean, it makes sense on the surface, right? So constraints in our world limit our ideal level of responding. Maybe I want to do woodwork for 12 hours a day, but I can't because I have to work, right? So I'm going to have to do something else. So maybe I want more TV, right? So, well, in order to want more TV, I'm going to have to do more homework because there's this balance, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to up the homework in order for me to get more TV. I'm trying to make sure that I get the maximum amount of reinforcers here, right? So again, low probability or high probability reinforces low probability. So I'm going to add this constraint of saying that I want more TV in my life, so I'm going to have to do more homework now. But that also means I'm going to have to cut something else out, right? Because I'm going to lose some time there. Right? But that's just one of those implications that we deal with. Right? So response deprivation and bliss, if we restrict TV access, right, then we can actually turn it into a reinforcer for studying. So now I can increase the amount of studying I do, and I can get more television as a result, ultimately because I did my studying. So I can maintain that bliss level with at TV, whatever my standard rate of bliss is for TV, right? And we can use that also to reinforce my studying behavior. You might lose out on some other behaviors, but at least we're achieving that particular bliss, right? So in other words, to return to that that bliss level of TV watching, we must do our homework, right? So this is really a self-management sort of thing. You can also manage other people's behavior this way. So again, they're going to want to watch X amount of hours of TV a day, or somebody is. So if you restrict access to it and then provide that as a reinforcer only for studying, then your studying is going to go up and you're going to get more TV and you'll be at that bliss level and you tend to stabilize it, right? So in other words, it's all about getting to the bliss, right? It's all about the reinforcers and what you're earning. And we do know that people like to earn and maintain a particular level of reinforcement. Now, it's different for everybody. And that's one of the big problems with this behavioral bliss stuff. And in fact, I don't even have it in here, but it's huge. It's a huge issue. And you guys may have thought about it already. It's like, well, how do I know what the bliss level is? You don't. It's different for everybody. And it's kind of a big guess, right? You have to just let behavior happen willy-nilly and find out what people would do if given an opportunity to do it. And then from there, you can start to put constraints on stuff and, restrict access to TV and all those things. All right, I hope this helps. It should clarify some of the stuff for the test and should clarify some of that pretty heavy book stuff. Talk to you soon.